Hey guys, this time I'm going to show you how to remove the engine. The engine is the beating heart of any bike. You may need to remove the engine if you suspect problems with the pistons, cam, crankshaft, or transmission. Here's a quick recap of my project thus far. I bought a bike with motor problems for cheap, and my local Honda Powersports dealership confirmed that it's probably the crankshaft and or rod bearings. I didn't want to pay $2,000 for repairs, so I'm seeing whether I can figure it out for myself. So far I've put the bike on stands, removed the fairings, removed the battery, drained the coolant, drained the oil, removed the fuel tank, airbox, and throttle body, and removed the exhaust. I made videos about each of those steps, so check out those if you want more details. Links are in the video description. Before continuing, let me reiterate how important it is to keep track of your parts and fasteners. Where possible, I just put the fastener back in its home on the engine. If it needs to come off, I bag and tag. Alright, the engine is currently held in the frame by a handful of mounting bolts, but before we can undo those, there are a couple of other connections that we need to address first. The drive sprocket cover, the clutch cable, 2 starter motor wires, the gearshift arm, the drive chain, 2 radiator hoses, the spark plug, and 4 electrical connectors. The drive sprocket cover is held on by 2 8mm bolts. Remove the bolts and pull off the cover. You'll need to maneuver it a little because there's a metal bit that goes around the far side of the chain. My bike hasn't been ridden in a while, and I know it got rained on during the trailer ride home from the dealership, so I'm not surprised at the rust. I'm going to spritz on some penetrating oil here and come back to it later. The clutch cable is held in place by the clutch guide and the tip of the cable. Take out the 2 8mm bolts and then disconnect the end of the cable by pushing it forward and then up and out of the keyhole type catch. The 2 starter motor wires. The positive terminal is covered by a black rubber cap. Pull it back and then remove the 10mm nut. The negative terminal is to the left and is held in place by one of the starter motor mounting bolts. Both of these fasteners can be stored on the engine itself. The gearshift arm is held in place by a pinch bolt and splines. You'll need to back off the 10mm pinch bolt all the way because the splines have a scallop in the middle that the pinch bolt passes through. Once the bolt is out, you can just pull the gearshift arm off of the splines. I then reinstalled the pinch bolt for storage. Drive chain. To free the engine from the chain, there's a couple of steps. We're going to need to remove the drive sprocket, but to do that we need to put some slack in the chain. To put slack in the chain, we need to scoot the rear wheel forward, which means we need to loosen the rear axle and adjusting nuts. Use a 19mm socket on the axle bolt and an adjustable wrench on the axle nut. I set it up so that my service stand will catch the wrench because it would be fairly awkward for me to try to reach both sides and put enough force to break it free. Once the axle is loose, use a 12mm wrench to loosen the left and right lock nuts, and then a 14mm wrench to loosen the left and right adjusting nuts. After there's plenty of room, push the rear wheel forward. Now we can remove the 2 10mm bolts holding the sprocket in place. To stop the sprocket from turning with the nuts, put a 2x4 through the rear wheel. This will catch on the service stand and allow you to break the bolts free. With the bolts out, the fixing plate and the sprocket itself will slide off the splines. Don't try to remove the chain from the sprocket while it's still on the engine. The sprocket comes off easily and the chain will be super easy to take off after the sprocket is free. 2 radiator hoses. Pretty straightforward. Loosen the hose clamp with a 6mm wrench, scoot it out of the way, and pull the hose free of the barb. Pro tip here, don't place expensive electronics like video cameras near the hose while pulling it free. Even though the coolant was drained previously, there will be some non-zero amount of coolant in the hoses, so expect some coolant to splash out. Don't ask me how I learned this. The spark plug is right on the very top of the engine, and it was pretty awkward to try to pull out. I ended up removing the rubber skirts to try to improve access. I should also point out I stuffed a shop towel into the inlet to prevent debris from falling in there. Anyhow, I eventually figured out that using a large flathead screwdriver as a lever makes unplugging the spark plug much easier. 4 electrical connections. Start by unplugging these 3 white connections under the bell-shaped cover. Each socket is slightly different, so we don't need to keep track of which one goes to which. There's also a gray 3-pin connector over here in the middle of the engine. With the connections unplugged, you should also make sure the routing is free. When the engine is lowered, we don't want to catch the wires on the frame. At this point, the only things holding the engine to the frame are the mounting bolts. Before we undo those, we need to put a jack or other adjustable support under the engine so we can actually remove the mounts, and also so we can safely lower the engine once it's free. Throughout the mounting bolt removal process, you may need to adjust the jack to accommodate changes in the amount of support it's providing. Start at the front. There are 2 mounting bolts, 2 nuts, and 2 engine hanger plate bolts. The front upper bolt is 14mm and has a 14mm nut. The front lower bolt is 14mm and uses a 17mm nut. If you're having trouble getting the mounting bolts to slide out, you can use a rubber mallet, but be gentle, you don't want to damage these threads. You also need to take off the hanger plates, which are each held on with one 14mm bolt. Last, there are 2 mounting bolts and nuts at the rear, one upper and one lower. Both bolts and both nuts are all 14mm. With all the mounting bolts removed, the only thing holding the engine up is the jack. Slowly lower the jack while rotating the top of the engine toward the back and sliding the bottom of the engine forward. Depending on the size of your jack in the down position, you may need to pull the jack out from underneath to get the last few inches of clearance needed to free the engine. This thing weighs about 80 pounds, so set it on a sturdy surface. That was definitely the most ambitious thing I've ever done on a vehicle. And it really wasn't that bad. Take your time and just keep reminding yourself that this is nothing more than a glorified Lego set. Thanks for watching. That's it for this time. Have a good one.